Hitchcock, who is going to be talking about the selection of path-specific effects.
All right, how's this for volume? People tell me to shut up a lot more than they tell me to speak up, so I take that as evidence that I normally speak loudly enough. Okay, there's a... Can I put this in my pocket? Will it still work? Does that still work if it's in my pocket?
Yeah.
Okay. So there's a story that's getting increasingly familiar. Maybe this is the only conference where I can describe it as a familiar story. But it's a story that goes like this, that causal judgment, causal assessment involves counterfactual reasoning, reasoning about non-actual possibilities. But counterfactual reasoning is subject to effects of which possibilities are available, which non-actual possibilities are we likely to think of, or which ones are most salient, or which are most easily accessible. Available is the terminology from Kahneman and Tversky. And so that the availability of possibilities is influenced by norms, where norms is kind of this deliberately squishy term that encompasses both things like statistical frequency, but also moral rules, maybe how stereotypical something is, whether norm can include norms of proper functioning, so it's a kind of a deliberately sludgy term. But this influences how available possibilities are, such that normal possibilities are more readily thought of when we engage in counterfactual reasoning. So there are at least 3 different kinds of counterfactual targets, or I might call them loci of counterfactual thinking, that might be involved in causal reasoning. So the most obvious one is the candidate cause itself. So for instance, if we want to know whether C is a cause of E, we naturally consider the counterfactual. If C hadn't occurred, would E have occurred? And therefore, kind of the normative status of C can influence how readily we engage this counterfactual. So this idea that norms, or how normal C is, can influence whether we judge C to be a cause, I think at least traces back to Hart and Honoré in their book Causation in the Law. So they're kind of legal philosophers sort of propose this as an understanding of causation in the law. In the empirical literature, the most famous, probably the best known example of this is the one from Nobin Fraser involving that evil Professor Smith who steals all the pens that probably most of you are familiar with. And where the fact that it's against the rules for Professor Smith to steal the pen, but to take the pens makes us inclined to judge that he's a cause of the ensuing problem. A second locus of counterfactual reasoning is alternative possible causes of E. So for instance, if A is an alternative possible cause of E, we might wonder, for instance, given that C occurred and E occurred, would E still have occurred if A hadn't been there, right? So we might engage in these kinds of counterfactual reasonings. There's a very nice recent paper by Jonathan Kaminsky, and I originally had et al., but I realized since Jonathan Phillips and Toby Gerstenberg are both here, I made it. I put 60% of the authorship on the slide, and the other 2 we just forget about. And showing this effect, so that even if you leave the normative status of C unchanged, that changing the normative status of A can influence whether you judge C to be a cause of B. So it's sort of, that's not immediately intuitive that should be the case, but it turns out that it does work that way. I want to talk today about a third kind of target, and this is causal intermediates. So events that occur between the candidate cause and the candidate effect. So something like B, where B is some kind of variable or some kind of event that occurs between C and E, and there may be multiple causal pathways. And specifically, these kind of intermediates play a role in assessing path-specific effects. So what do I mean by path-specific effects? Well, rather than, there's a kind of formalism you can use to explain this precisely, but rather than try to do that in during my 15 minutes of fame, I'll just try to give you a picture. So we sort of have a picture, we've got C, and it influences E by these two different groups. And you kind of think of, if you engage the counterfactual, if C hadn't occurred, we kind of sometimes talk about that as we're hypothetically wiggling C. So we're going to take C and we're going to kind of wiggle it. So here's what happens if you wiggle C. So C jerks around, and that kind of jerkiness, or that kind of wiggle, propagates up the graph, and it propagates up these two paths. Maybe I'll do it one more time. And they can either, the sort of influence that's propagating up these two paths can either, maybe they can mutually reinforce one another, they might cancel each other out, or they might kind of interact to produce some sort of novel effect. Well, suppose we want to know what the effect of C on E is specifically along this path. How can we assess that, or how can we think about that? Well, the way we can think about that is by, as we're clamping the other path in place. We're going to hold it in place and not let it wiggle. So now when we wiggle C, that sort of perturbation is going to travel up one path, but not up the other. And we're going to isolate the influence of C on E along that one path. And if you think about that, the counterfactual that you are assessing when you engage that piece of reasoning is this one. If C hadn't occurred, but B had occurred anyway, right? Even though we've removed C, which is a cause of B, we're going to assume that B still occurred. What would have happened? So this is a bit tricky. I've learned from talking with psychologists and people in other fields that philosophers use the term counterfactually much more broadly than others do. So the sense in which we're engaging in counterfactual reasoning about B, where B actually did occur, and in our hypothetical, B did occur. So what we're changing is not the occurrence of B, but rather the dependence of B on C, right? So kind of the change we're making to B is not whether it occurs, but its dependence on C. So it's sort of a little odd to call this a counterfactual, but it's a kind of counterfactual reasoning, a kind of hypothetical intervention we're performing to fix B regardless of what happens with C. Okay, so these path-specific effects figure prominently in philosophical accounts of actual causation. So these are accounts of what sometimes called causal attribution. So particular events play out in a particular way, and we're asked whether this particular event caused this particular event. Did Susie's throwing her rock cause the window to break? And this is referred to as actual causation, that specific kind of relation. So I think the idea at least goes back to David Lewis, who sort of proposed this idea of chaining relations of counterfactual dependence. I've got a paper trying to show how you can define actual causation in terms of this path-specific dependence. Halpern and Pearl. It turns out these definitions all tend to be sort of intuitively too liberal. They admit things that we wouldn't normally count as actual causes. And one strategy for restricting them is to sort of employ this familiar move. So appeal to norms, considerations of normality, to kind of restrict which kind of counterfactuals we allow. So just as normality can influence how likely we are to engage the counterfactual if C hadn't occurred, it can also influence how likely we are to engage a counterfactual like if C hadn't occurred but B had occurred anyway. So I think this probably Peter Menzies is the first to kind of propose this idea. Otherwise, your name has to start with H. Okay, I don't actually know of empirical work testing this, so this is a great conference for me to sort of advertise psychologists who test this. But kind of, that what counts for empirical work among philosophers, namely, what's your intuition about this? Okay, I'll go down what's your intuition about this? It sort of suggests that introducing these elements of normality get these accounts to better fit our judgments. But what I want to talk about in what's left of my 15 minutes of fame is the question of kind of why are we interested in these path-specific effects? After all, you can define all, once you've got this sort of apparatus, you can define all sorts of relations. This is just one among many, but why is this, we engage in this practice so much? What caused this to happen? Why are we interested in path-specific effects? And why might we specifically be interested in path-specific effects involving counterfactuals with normal possibilities? Why might normality influence the sort of counterfactuals we find interesting or important? So kind of what function might this play in our cognitive economy? Why is it that we go around making these causal attributions? What sort of cache value does it have? So I'm going to try to sort of suggest an answer in two parts. So one part is epistemological. Epistemologically, it's often easier to identify path-specific effects than wholesale counterfactual dependence. So here's an example. So consider wearing a bicycle helmet. The reason people wear bicycle helmets is because it influences whether or not you get a head injury. In particular, it should prevent head injury, on a reduced likelihood of head injury or the severity of head injury. If you're in an accident while riding. Well, there's this sort of paradox that a fairly common pattern is that municipalities or states, or countries even, that implement bicycle helmet laws don't see a dramatic reduction in head injuries among cyclists, and people kind of studied why that is. And they found out that there's sort of all these other ways in which wearing a bicycle helmet can influence behavior. So there's some evidence that people that wear bicycle helmets may actually drive less safely, whether they have a feeling of invincibility or for whatever reason. It can influence the behavior of drivers. So there was a study done on how close will a car approach you, or how close will a car be to you when it passes. And it will pass more closely if you're wearing a bicycle helmet. Sort of bizarrely, if you want to know what form of headgear will keep the cars at the furthest distance, it's a blonde wig. So, and whether that's because drivers think that blondes are delicate and precious, or whether they think they're really badass and you don't want to mess with them, I don't know, but one or the other of those. And you can kind of imagine other possibilities. Maybe a bicycle helmet interferes with visibility or something like that. So there's a sort of obvious influence about how you've got a helmet on your head, and if you bang your head, the helmet will protect you. But there are all these other ways in which wearing a bicycle helmet might influence whether or not you get in an accident, which itself influences whether you have a head injury. This is very complicated to assess all this. So kind of imagine an incident. Susie, it's always Susie and Billy. I guess Ned Hall. Is that Lori? Is that right? It's originally due to Ned.
Yeah, kind of us in grad school.
Yeah, you in grad school. Okay. So she's in an accident while cycling. She hits her head on the curb, but fortunately she's wearing a bicycle helmet. She doesn't suffer any serious injury. Okay. Now, in this case, it's relatively easy to consider the following counterfactual. Suppose she hadn't worn a helmet, but had otherwise been in an accident exactly like this one, right? And then you can kind of reason, okay, given the amount of impact or the severity of the impact, we can kind of, we may maybe not exactly know, but we can make a pretty good guess that, oh, she would have suffered a serious head injury. It's much harder to sort of consider the counterfactual if Susie hadn't worn a helmet, and where you have to kind of trace all the possible effects. Would she have ridden differently? Would the car have stayed further away from her? It's much harder to answer those questions. So it's often easier after the fact to answer counterfactuals where you hold certain aspects of the thing fixed, even though those things might have depended on the thing you're wiggling or varying. So there's a kind of epistemological ease in assessing these path-specific effects. Second, from a kind of practical reasoning perspective, so why do we want to have causal information? Well, one of the reasons is that causes are handles on the world. Causes are tools we can use to achieve our end, right? If I want to, if I want to cure a bacterial infection and I know that this drug cures bacterial infections, and this is an effective means towards that end. But if you think of it in the way sort of normal decision theory is often formulated, if Susie's just got a one-shot decision, she's got to wear her helmet or not, and then just go with the flow, right? And then sort of let events unfold as they may. If that's the kind of choice situation she's in, she would need to consider, the total effect, all of the effects of wearing a helmet, the effect on her own riding behavior, the effect on other drivers, and so on and so forth. So knowing the path-specific effect itself wouldn't be of much use to her, or it would only, at best, only kind of suggest a possibility. On the other hand, suppose she thinks of this as kind of a multi-step process. Well, first I'm going to decide whether or not to wear a helmet, but then I can kind of see how things are going, and if there's some kind of bad effects or bad consequences of that first choice, I can maybe try to mitigate them, or maybe try to undo them, or maybe try to change them. So I'm not just thinking this as a one-step decision, but this is kind of a multi-stage process, right? So, I can think about, if drivers are driving more closely to me, maybe I can do something to mitigate that, or maybe I can sort of observe that I drive more recklessly when I have a helmet. I could, try to self-consciously drive as carefully as I do if I don't have a helmet. And it's sort of adding a blonde wig, and keeping drivers at bay. Maybe, this affects my visibility, I can add mirrors. So if you're in a decision situation where you're able to make multiple interventions, it's not just a one-shot decision, but you can intervene at multiple points along the way, then understanding these path-specific effects become important, because you want to know how your first decision is going to work in conjunction with decisions that you're going to make later, right? So you're sort of thinking of your current decision, your current intervention, as working in collaboration with later interventions, where some of those interventions are going to be to undo effects of that first decision. So in effect, kind of, she can think of this as, if I wear a bicycle helmet, that might have these undesirable effects. Well, I can kind of try to cancel out those effects. Sort of later on, I can make decisions that undo those effects. And so now when she's thinking about whether or not to wear a bicycle, she's just interested in, given that I'm taking these other steps to kind of ameliorate the tendency of wearing a bicycle helmet to make you likely to get in an accident, she's only going to be interested in this effect. This is going to be kind of the main effect she needs to worry about. Moreover, if you're in this multi-stage decision kind of problem, you're going to be particularly interested in how your current decision is going to work in conjunction with, what kinds of further steps? Well, further steps that are ones you're likely to make, ones that are feasible, and ones that are desirable, right? Ones that would be good for you to make. So this provides a reason why you want to know how your current choice is going to work in conjunction, not just with arbitrary future interventions, but with normal interventions in both the statistical and the kind of moral or evaluative sense of